Welcome, everybody. Today usually would be the conversation, but somehow we got a little geopolitical, and before we know it, we had a special guest, and I've lost control of my own show, thanks to Sam Drizzy, so we really appreciate that. But we have a special guest here, a Rabo in the Discord, but he is one of the primary content creators, or the primary content creator, of Mo Freedom Foundation, a YouTube channel with 31,000 subscribers. So thank you for being here. I quite honestly don't know what much to expect on this one, so we're probably going to do a little geopolitical theory, who our influences are, and we're probably going from there. So introduce yourself, sir. Who do we have as our wonderful guest?
Sure. My name is Robert Morris. I am essentially the Mo Freedom Foundation. I definitely have a lot of great supporters and some folks who work with me for moderating and whatnot, but I do at this point provide pretty much all the content of the Mo Freedom Foundation with the support of some pretty amazing patrons. I sort of found my way onto YouTube rather strangely. I was doing corporate law in Istanbul, and I'd always sort of had a YouTube channel, found it kind of interesting. I was very interested in criminal justice issues, still am, in the United States, and I'd sort of made some rabble-rousing YouTube videos seen by essentially nobody. And then in 2013, I ended up sort of getting caught up in a bit of a national uprising and sort of decided, had a bit of a crisis of conscience, I guess. So what am I doing with my life? Making the world safer for banks. Also, my business completely evaporated. So it was very easy to have a crisis of conscience there. And I started doing YouTube full time. And I'd say my focus is probably U.S. foreign policy. That's what I talk about the most. And I think it would be fair to characterize me as extremely critical of U.S. foreign policy, to put it extremely lightly. Whenever I go on these things, I feel that I talk too much. So is that a sufficient introduction?
That is a sufficient introduction, and don't worry, if I feel like you're talking too much, I'll bully into it. So
good to hear it.
I like to hear.
I need to be changed.
I like to hear the sound of my own voice. I can't lie. But on the other side of that, so I guess we're kind of getting acquainted here. My name's Tyberius D. I study economics and political science. I have no degrees in any, but what I do is I'm kind of a hobbyist that spends a little too much time looking into geopolitical matters, and I do a number of presentations, that kind of thing on YouTube, wanting to go more professional in the ways that I would like to do, like public speaking and go on the tours to do that, but haven't gotten the clout for that yet. But trying to build up my resume, and as far as what I know, my knowledge base, I take a lot of, I'll put it this way, I take a lot of steps from Peter Zeihan, but there's a few people from that clout that I also take some steps from. I think Ian Bremmer is incredibly brilliant, but he's taken a few L's lately, but I kind of saw that one coming. And then George Freeman is also a very interesting character. I like to look into his works, although I tend to disagree with him on almost everything. But I like to see him, or kind of following with listening to people who know more than me, who have been in the business far longer than I have, kind of picking up what they've been successful with, what they've been unsuccessful with, and seeing where I can go with it as well. When it comes to U.S. foreign policy, I've always been an avid watcher. Like, I remember being in grade school and you'd see the Iraq War back in 2003 go on, and I'm like, oh, they've got Hellfire missiles and all this stuff. I'm like, oh, it was cool then you get older and then you kind of realize and metabolize these things. I was the only person in 2006 who knew when the Israelis invaded Lebanon where any of it was. So it's just one of those deals too where I've had a very interesting role with this because I've always been fascinated by with it, and now I kind of want to spread that fascination to other people, because there's some people who do seem to know what's going on far better than other people, and particularly why. So I want to send this question off to you, which is, who is your biggest influences? Who do you think has got it right more than others?
I'm not someone who's gifted with a lot of humility. I feel like it's actually a very hard question. I think I take valuable influence from a range of folks. I focus more on historians. I think probably the historian that made the most difference for me was a guy named C.A. Bailey. I think he unfortunately died a little too early, but fairly recently, He was, I believe, a British historian who was focused on the British Empire, but he wrote this it's just life-changing book for me called The Birth of the Modern World. And he just, it is not a page turner, but he just laid out in very simple ways just the way that sort of the modern world came about. And I don't think he really makes much of an explicit point about it. It was just really stunning, just sort of seeing the world get sort of knit together in the 19th century. And I think as far as like intellectual signposts, for me, that's really, really huge. And I've written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, talking about how the U.S. Empire and the British Empire are actually quite similar in ways that we do not spend enough time acknowledging. And actually that I feel like the United States is making very similar errors, which can be sort of, you can miss that because the British Empire is so violent in a different way from the way that the U.S. Empire was. Anyway, I'm digressing a bit here. But C.A. Bailey's Transformation of the Modern World is tremendously influential for me. I know Steven Pinker has become latterly more controversial or sort of, quasi-intellectual dark web or what have you, but his Better Angels of Our Natures, from, I guess, probably about a decade back at this point, made a huge difference to me. And I think while I am very familiar with all of the arguments against his sort of central thesis that things have been improving, that, the long peace is a thing, I'm very aware of those, have dived into them. I think they're important, but I also think they kind of fail to take out his thesis. And I do think the world under U.S. empire, despite my many, many, many critiques of it, I do think has actually been better in a lot of ways over the past 70 years. So those are some influences. As far as in the realm of geopolitics, I enjoy Peter Zeihan because I think he gets vastly more right than your average schmo at the Council on Foreign Relations or something like that. But I also have some pretty strong critiques of the way he approaches certain things. Probably more in his approach or attitude than in and some of the details as well. There's some real basics that I think he misses, but also he's vastly more quantified in his approach and could no doubt get me chapter and verse on river systems and grain silos and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think there's some big things that he misses. Perhaps we can talk about that more.
Gotcha. I would like to kind of revisit that because I do have like 2 or 3 major criticisms of Zeihan, but I never get to into that. I kind of get thrown the Zeihan fanboy there, but I'm not going to hate it because Zeihan has proved remarkably far more correct than most of the people that have been kind of like I would call them charlatans, honestly. There's a lot of people who like to claim they're soothsayers, but they don't turn out to be very right for very long. And what's remarkably been well for me is 2 groups of people, Zeihan being one of them, but also give me just a second, Strauss and Howe. The people who came up with generational theory, these are the guys who came up with the term millennials and whatever. They give you the 4 turnings, right? They've been remarkably right as well so far too. They just have one critical thing that I really want to punch out, and is that are the millennials the actual second coming of the great generation? Holding out on that one. We're not doing so well, but if they turn out to be right on that, I'll be tickled. Anyway, what I do want to get into, or I want to ask you up, because you talk a lot about the American Empire and Steven Pinker, which, God, his book was so big, but it was also incredibly enlightening. What I will say is that I've always said that the American Empire is a little different than any other empire before because we prefer indirect rule. We don't come in, take over your land, call it a province of the empire, and move on. We kind of are one of these folks that's like, hey, look, we will economically, socially, politically, and militarily dominate you, but we will give you like some level of limited autonomy or outright autonomy that makes it to where you don't have to do everything we do, but you have to be on the same page. And getting a lot of the former imperial powers, and I think it's now up to 10 that are now going to be all under the U.S. aegis, whether you call it NATO or the alliance system, what have you. You have the Japanese, you have the Swedes are about to join, you have the Germans, the French, the Italians, the British, the Poles. Literally almost every imperial power is now under the American aegis, excluding Russia and the Chinese. So I think this has been a massive success for humanity, just in the fact that we probably have kept another major World War or two happening. We can talk about nukes if you want. But I think the American Empire has been a resounding success, but that time is kind of coming to an end. So I would love your take on that.
There's a lot there. I think the close, to take the closing point, I think that the greatest enemy by far of the, and I think it's a truly tragic thing, like in terms of like Greek tragedy or what have you. Like I think that Washington D.C. is by far the greatest threat to the near utopia that Washington D.C. built over the past 7 years. By far, it's not even a question. I would argue, well, I support Ukrainian independence, et cetera, et cetera. I would argue that we're in a period where I'd say the world is in a more dangerous space than it has been in since the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think, you look at, what do they call Königsberg now? Kaliningrad or what have you. I mean, that seems to have been recently diffused. But, I mean, we're in this space where we're just, we're in a much more dangerous space that Washington, D.C. has largely created. Like, I'm a fan of Zelensky, I'm a fan of Ukrainian independence, but fundamentally I believe in February, Putin walked into a trap that the United States had laid for them, for Russia. I mean, I think it was a situation that we sort of created, and we've created just a really, really dangerous situation that has the strong risk of sort of invalidating everything that has gone before. We've managed 70 years of peace, but if we were by far the most powerful country, if we were, by far the greatest beneficiary of this 70 years of peace, and it ends in a nuclear apocalypse, then
was it worth it?
How much did we really accomplish? And I think that it's very interesting sort of talking about the distinction between the United States and all other empires, whereas I would make a distinction between the British Empire, the U.S. Empire, and all other empires. Mm-hmm. I would argue that actually sort of like the modern world, by the way, this is sort of I would have to say this is a corruption or a bastardization of C.A. Bailey's much more sophisticated and carefully worded argument. I never want to say that it's but obviously inspired by his work. But sort of the modern world essentially started in the 1750s with the 7 Years' War. And this is one of my main critiques of Zeihan, actually, that I think is probably the main thing that he misses, is that he sort of maintains, well, before the Pax Americana, before World War II, it was these empires scrabbling against each other and da-da-da-da. And no, it wasn't. I think your point about informal empire is really, really key and really important. Because while the British did, for national prestige issues, and usually, I'd say almost entirely, with the exception of India, that was actually sort of useful to them as like an imperial domain, they would, for prestige issues, occasionally end up having to go in and fight somebody, they send a religious crackpot into Sudan who's killed by a religious crackpot, so Britain has to take over Sudan for the next 80 years or they look weak. I mean, that kind of dumb shit. But what the British Empire really was an informal empire of staggering scope. You were talking about NATO wrapping in old imperial powers, but I mean, China, the Ottoman Empire, these were tremendous powers of the 19th century that were nominally independent throughout the 19th century, but you literally had British guys running their customs. British guys working for the Foreign Office running all of their customs systems. So this is to differing extents in both the Ottoman Empire and China. I think what Zeihan really misses, and I think why I think the British Empire example is so important, is that really the British ran the world. And then they fucked it up. It ended in apocalypse. And I think there's a lot of parallels between the Scramble for Africa, which was Britain unnecessarily setting the terms of prestige and power in just really dumb, aggressive ways. A lot of parallels between that and the war on terror with the United States setting. I mean, Putin is a piece of shit, violent bastard. He's a poor man's George W. Bush. He learned it from watching us.
Okay.
He learned it. I mean, he learned it. That's, we taught, this is what we said, this is what a great power does. And Russia is married to the delusion that it's still a great power. It's, and unfortunately, it seems thus far that China has had the sense to not fall for that. But I don't know how long that's going to last. That's sort of my riff on that.
I find this very interesting because there is some levels where I can't verify everything you said because I don't know, but you do have China coming, or I'm sorry, excuse me, let me rephrase that. You have Britain coming in the late 1700s into India and largely taking over the subcontinent within 100 years. You have them, I'm not going to say they outright do it, but they largely are able to subjugate China in two major wars, that being the Opium Wars. Britain is kind of unrivaled from basically the defeat of Napoleon all the way up until, I would honestly say, the rise of Germany, or at least the creation of the High Seas Fleet, is when Britain starts kind of panicking, realizing the world's coming out of their grasp. And it's kind of interesting because instead of having it to where somebody just kind of knocks Britain down a peg, it's that the whole system, in a large degree, kind of breaks down, where you have the French or occupied for 4 years under the Nazis. You have Germany bombed to smithereens. Russia's lost 1/4 of its population. Basically, when it's all said and done, is that you pretty much have the Americans and the Soviets as the only powers that are even viable come from 1946. And so there's a level where I do definitely follow with Zeihan because I think he gets the lines there correctly. But I kind of want to put it out there in the regards that I think the thing that really upsets everything for the Brits is the Germans, because Germany is so stupidly strong as a continental European power.
But did Britain really need to be there? I mean, obviously in World War II, after everything was well and truly fucked. I mean, I'm Charles Lindbergh America Firster or something. Obviously, World War II was something that, if you're a civilized human being, you desperately, you needed to get involved and you needed to get against Hitler. But in World War I mean, it's, Britain had to get involved to save Belgium. And if you look at it, you're like, wait a second, why does Belgium exist? Oh yeah, Belgium exists because Britain carved it off of the Netherlands in the 1830s to play that role, to play the role of the tripwire. And I think the way that story is often told is that Germany sort of out of nowhere becomes incredibly powerful, and it's just like, really? Because if you look at it, pretty much at every step of Prussia's development, it was the British being like, here,
right,
we're here to save you, we're here to save you, we're here to save you. And that extends far beyond that. We were very lucky in that the Germans had someone who was sensible, sort of Bismarck running the place up to Kaiser Wilhelm, but the British did not need to do, the Scramble of Africa shit that they did. They did not need to do the Boer War. This idea that Germany had all this incredible power. I mean, it really didn't. I think they largely gave up on their what's the word? Their naval plans. Before World War I, they were just sort of actually, we're going to stop trying to compete with the British here. And it was the British choice to get involved in this war, which is debatable, and but also just the 100 years before that, where Britain largely created Germany, that I think people don't pay enough attention to. And it's those kinds of missteps. If we're truly going to learn from the failures of the first true world empire, it's that kind of stuff I wish we would focus on more. Sorry.
Let me ask both of you guys, we're talking a lot about empires here, and I think I was particularly interested in how you were talking about how the British customs people were there running the trade offices of these, what in the Middle Ages were dominant powers like China, and the Ming Empire was like huge, huge and incredibly dominant. So in just a few hundred years, it was not, right. So let me ask why you both think the empires perpetuate themselves, right? Like, what is the purpose of the empire and what drives it forward? Because in my perspective, the purpose of the empire is to open up opportunities for powerful families to make money. And as long as you're doing that, you're going to end up getting involved in conflicts, right? But if you're not doing that, then you end up in trouble politically. And so I feel like empire is actually a way to keep the prosperity flowing, to keep the system stable, and keep the ambitions, the political ambitions of powerful people placated. And so I wonder if you all see it the same way, and if you see the move toward empire and getting involved internationally as sort of like an extension of elite power politics, or if you disagree about that.
I'm gonna let you take that one first, Robert.
I think it's a fascinatingly huge question. And I think that if you look at ancient empires, then yeah, obviously it's exclusively. I mean, it's almost exclusively about elite perpetuation, and I mean the Ottomans are a great example that they are truly world beating while they are expanding. Just the Europeans had no idea what hit them in the 1300s and 1400s. But then when the Ottomans, and they were ferocious and unbeatable because of principles that go back through every ancient empire, really just polity, going down to pre-agriculture, just the ability of the Sultan to hand out gifts developed by by conquest. And one thing that's really frustrating to me is that I do believe that the British and US empires were both different in that they didn't have to be so oriented around elite profiteering. If you look at like the Scramble for Africa, this was sort of a key point in that What If All His video. It's very true that no European empire benefited financially from these African empires. They did not. Individual Europeans got obscenely wealthy because they were able to capture and direct state resources towards themselves. So, and I think this is actually very, very closely analogous again to the War on Terror, where like we didn't have to do any of that shit after 2001. And obviously the US taxpayer has not gotten a goddamn thing. But the equivalent of like Cecil Rhodes and his diamond mines that he got very, very wealthy off of,
right,
that, the British sacrificed, probably ended up in the world wars to give dipshits like Cecil Rhodes, diamond mines. Well, we got a scholarship out of it. There's a direct parallel to like the existence of people like what's the Amway kid, the mercenary, the Blackwater, the whatever, just
Eric?
like yeah, that guy, Freddie Prinze, whatever. The whole military industrial complex stuff, it's the exact same shit.
Yeah.
Because the US public did not, is obviously it was out like $6 trillion. Like a third of our national debt was pissed away in the Middle East for the past 20 years. And we didn't benefit from that at all, but there's a huge class of people in Washington D.C. who got filthy rich. So I perhaps you're right, and there's just something in the nature of empire and conquest that we have to end up in this stupid a place. But I think with empires before the British, that was most of the show, was like, we need to, perpetuate this elite, keep the elite happy enough, Like, we didn't really have to do that. And maybe the British was the same, but in the US, we didn't have to do what we did for the past 20 years. It's just such a colossal waste to the benefit of nobody other than a few defense contractors.
I guess my observation is just that it's possible that it's just that pursuing conflict through empire is like just the most irresistible distraction for unruly and restive populace, and it's also a way to keep elites from inside the system, as opposed to adventuring in funding counter regime activity, right? So that's possible, and I don't have the answer to that either. But one thing that I do want to bring up here, which I find super interesting, I would look at your take on this as well. I sort of see the U.S. empire as the continuation of the British Empire in a lot of ways, because we're the second English-speaking empire, and I would say as a former colony of the British that adopted their whole legal structure and everything, right? That we're just we are the British Empire, but we're just the next stopgap that the West, as defined by the British, was using to save itself for another 70 years, as it was teetering on the natural end of its cycle of upswing. So the way that I see it right now is the way that the process I see happening right now is for example, when you've done all the conquering you can do, and you've done all the industrializing you can do domestically, right? You've grown all the business, you've got the optimum ratio of capital to labor and resources, right, in your little domain. But you've got a bunch of people who've gotten rich off of that, and they need some place to put their money. Where a country where there isn't that optimum ratio yet, and you need to get a return. And people need to retire. God damn it, they need to retire in nice houses. And so I think the lead up to World War I and World War II was all about your old money in Europe finding a home with a return on investing in the United States, and they built up the United States to the point that then they were over-investing and everything collapsed in the Great Depression, right? And I think that what's happening right now with the baby boomers, both in the U.S. and abroad, they're looking for they're nearing retirement, they're getting close, they need that extra few percentage of return, and they're looking for any place that could give them those percentage points of yield on their investment. And I think that the reason why we've seen China's rise over the last 30 years is because the global West, not just the Americans, but the Europeans too, everybody needed yield as they were nearing retirement, because we had this global population bulge and they wanted to retire. And China was their vehicle for getting that. And now that the baby boomers are retiring, we're just going to see a total collapse of the Chinese system, because all the money's going to dry up. And I think that I see echoes. It's not the same situation, but I see echoes of the end of the good times leading into the Great Depression, with what we're seeing right now for similar reasons. People with a lot of money who are looking to get a return on their money before they have to get out of the market.
Stop giving me so much to chew on, Sam. I want to answer your question real quick about why empire, because you said the empires, so I kind of want to lump most empires into this one, and this is just my general thesis for why empires exist. They're, in a nutshell, they're the balance between economies of scale and local efficiency and productivity. What we've seen throughout most empires is that they expand and they continue to actually absorb the entities that they interact with, to the point where they integrate that into a greater whole. And what really shows that's a nice name on Twitch. What really shows the competitiveness or the prosperity of these empires are they something that rapidly expand then collapse in on themselves like the Mongols, because they don't really integrate the system in and they don't generate that economy of scale, versus is it something like Rome that slowly eats but snowballs more and more and more, to where Rome does it. I'm going to largely say the Brits did it, and I'm going to largely say that the Americans have kind of followed suit in this, where they just put the most competitive parts of the system together to a degree where it's incredibly productive. The fact that we've had a 10-fold increase in global economic output, I don't think is an accident. I think that's because largely the Americans have led that. Part two. is that the reason why Britain goes to shit is just because you're talking about a country that's the size of Idaho, that has 60 million people. I mean, it works until it doesn't. And the problem is that you can't have a country the size of Idaho with 60 million people dominate the globe when you've got your next door neighbor has 300 million people, speaks your language, runs the finances, runs everything else, and then eventually they just take your shit. I mean, destroyers for bases, anyone. And I'm going to...
Can I just interject one thought real quick?
For it.
I think it's important. Yes, I agreed. It was ridiculous that the British were as powerful for as long as they were. Fundamentally ludicrous. But I think it's important to pay attention to the fact that, like, they had a long chain of screw-ups throughout the 19th century that led to their fall. Like, the U.S. was richer than Britain for, 45 years before 1945. And it took... there's a lot to be said for inertia, and this is, I think, why the U.S. can, if it plays its cards right, can remain dominant over China, essentially forever, if we stop fucking up as much as we have. So, I just want to say I agree entirely. Yeah, ridiculous that the British controlled everything, but it wasn't some law of gravity. It wasn't inevitable that they fell apart. It was a reaction to a series of choices that they made. And it's so important to emphasize, like, we have the ability to make those choices now.
You don't think that any of this is inevitable, like forces that are really deep and powerful that are moving? You think that it's actual decisions made by decision makers that lead to these downfalls?
I think obviously the decisions of decision makers are dramatically constrained by all manner of deep forces, 100% for sure. But still, I mean, it's a lot of it's amazing how much just stupid, dumb, corrupt, contingent actions by individual actors, contribute to this. It
is amazing, isn't it?
It's absolutely stunning.
I'm gonna sorry, I want to bully back in here for a second, because I agree with you, but I don't look at Britain being a colossal screw up in the same way that I look at, like, Germany. Because one of the things that really, like, breaks my heart as a what if should have happened in history, the fact that the Prussian Anglo alliance fell apart because you didn't have Bismarck there to largely either keep it in check or to maintain it, was a disaster. You have Wilhelm II and Admiral Tirpitz. It's like, yeah, we're gonna build a navy, guys. We're surrounded on all sides by land powers, but we'll build a navy. Excellent idea, guys. Couldn't have gone further. But the thing that I did want to hit is that I'm not going to dissuade from Robert's thoughts on that choices matter, and administration, if you will. Like, who you make up your statecraft really does matter. I think this is why the Japanese were so successful for as long as they were whenever China's getting its ass kicked, is because Japan made a decision to go a certain route, and it paid off for them until it didn't. But we'll go down that story later. But I wanted to rephrase this, because what really makes the United States and Britain so different is, I'm going to meme here for a second, but if any of y'all played Europa Universalis from Paradox, is that every country has these national ideas that they adopt, whether it's, going down a unitarian route or a tolerant route, or trading, or, a more militaristic route. And what the Americans particularly did far better, but the Brits did largely set the ground for, was going down the path of, instead of holding down to what we call the nobility throughout most of human history, and that, like, Europe still has this issue, where you have people who are big names that are literally had wealth for 400 years, is that Britain set a policy of one free trade, whereas anyone who was largely part of their collection didn't have to deal with tariffs, or if they did, it was largely within house, so you could access any part of that empire and get the things that you wanted from A to B. Kind of different. The other part of it was that you had a lessening of the nobility within Britain all the way back since Magna Carta. Don't get me wrong, it was absolutely there, but I think that what we did see was the raising of the merchant class, particularly within Britain, and then really America hypercharged this to where America's elites are not landed gentry. Literally none of them. They're all like tycoons, business millionaires, that kind of thing, or people who paid them. Go ahead.
In the South, they are. I mean, the Southern planters dominated our politics for the first, 80 years.
I'm not going to say that's entirely wrong, but I'm going to say is America as the overarching true excuse me, I cannot talk. I'm going to say, as America is the whole overarching thing, is that most of them are not like landed gentry. They are. We keep seeing this to where you get a new big name that pops up, like the Waltons, but 2 generations down, they're just no one talks about them anymore. It's always somebody else. It's a Bezos.
Doesn't mean they're not there.
Yeah. I mean, people still talk about the Rothschilds, right? But for me, it's been one of those things where we're a lot like Carthage, actually, and that if you got the money, you can pay your dues, you get to be in the club. And that's very different compared to what Europeans that we largely left. But I'm sure you have a lot to say about that.
Well, I actually agree, and I would just say off of that the big thing that the United States did differently that I think is smarter is to not lean in on ethnic nationalism as the basis for our collective, and that if we lean in on ethnic nationalism as the basis for keeping our national culture and unity together, I think that nationalism is basically a trap that will lead to the downfall of Europe, because it's not really going to hold together or work long term. So and it's made us so flexible, right? Like if let's say that Europe just the next 200 years is just hell for Europe, and they go to hell, then the United States, and let's say that East Asia does better, which I'm not saying that's going to be China, but it could be anywhere in East Asia. Say the pendulum swings east again. The United States should orient itself east and become and start adopting more pieces of that culture and still remain part of the vital fabric of the world, even as the West currently we align ourselves to the West, even if it goes down. The flexibility to adapt to changing cultural needs is hugely powerful in a way that I would sort of separate myself from the more conservative folks on that.
Robert.
I want to push back a little bit, but I think the point is generally sound. Like, yes, I think absolutely we go further towards egalitarianism than certainly than the British did. I mean, the extent to which the British aristocracy is still very much a thing. I mean, actually, Britain, because they never had a true cut their heads off revolution, I would argue contemporary Britain is more aristocratic than any other European country. I think is a very fair thing to say. But we are more egalitarian. We are less blood and soil based than others. But I think, though, both of those things have always been more. Those have always been aspirations that we've had, that we've gotten closer to than other, prior empires, certain European countries. But we are constantly
fighting
back and forth. Like, you talk about landed gentry, and honestly, the thing that I think about the most is California, because California totally has a landed gentry. Like, if your family purchased real estate in the 1950s, if you got on the real estate ladder, if your family got on the real estate ladder in the 1950s, you don't actually have to work, because, you bought one place and you can rent out a room and you can buy another place. You're landed gentry, and I think people complain a lot. People complain a lot about California politics. It's the Democrats that killed the plural, and it's like, sure, maybe I'm sure some of those details actually make sense, but primarily it's a landed gentry that doesn't pay property taxes. Constitutionally doesn't have to pay very high property taxes. They've been governed by Democrats, but that was something that the Republicans put in there in the 70s. I think that in the United States, yes, money is king. Yes, we're egalitarian. Yes, but we also have to be conscious that has to be renewed. That's not something that we're just always going to have. And I've seen some statistics, I don't know how credible they are, that actually argue that social mobility is higher in Europe now than it is in the United States. I find that hard to believe. I haven't looked into that in great detail, but the fact that you could massage numbers to get to a place that could plausibly present that picture is very troubling to me. So, I don't want to necessarily push it into contemporary politics, but I'm very concerned about, I think that aristocracies want to form. And I think we've got, sort of a top 20% aristocracy in this country, those who can benefit from owning a place, those who can benefit from owning investments. And I see it sort of, solidifying in sort of troubling ways.
I definitely get you there, and that's it's kind of one of those histories, like if this happens, like you like batten down the hatches kind of thing. Whether this is literally how we get the French Revolution on steroids. So like I don't think we need to revisit that. It's like at a certain point when people feel like the system isn't there for them, things start breaking very, very quickly. But it's this weird threshold. Like it took the Russians literally losing one of the most horrible wars in history for them to overthrow their own system, right? So everyone has a different threshold, but eventually we get there. What I do want to avoid temporary politics, but I am going to go back to something a little bit spicy that our good friend Sam brought up, and that was like the ethnonational point. It's weird because the United States has always had a different thought or a different process on how it interpreted who is American. Originally, you had the whole WASP thing, right? And it was basically you were Anglo or you were Dutch or you were non-American. But the French were quickly brought into that, and then very quickly the Germans after that. Some people debate the Irish, but hey, I'll leave that out. The long and the short for me is that the United States, I think, contends with this more than any other nation, but it still has an element that's there. And we are literally, if it wasn't for the United States, there would not be white people. It would never be seen as that. It would never be interpreted as that. It would be still, you would be Dutch or you'd be Anglo or you'd be German or you'd be French. The fact that white people are seen as anything as all, I think is entirely responsible to the United States. I can't wait to hear what your thoughts are, Robert. But my theory going forward is that there's still going to largely be a quote-unquote white America, but it's going to look a lot more Hispanic, and they're actually going to be inducted into what is called white culture or white people. So there's your racy, spicy take there, but I think that's the future, and I've kind of been talking about it with. Go ahead, Robert.
I think you can make, certainly make all kinds of cases that like the details of whiteness, constructed whiteness, and put on, lefty academic hat or something, have a lot to do with the specifics of slavery in the United States. But this idea that we've sort of invented, the idea of white people, I think might go a little bit far. I mean, European, throughout the, 150 years or so of, European hegemony, I think the color line was important in every country they were in. Was something that was emphasized, and I think that sort of ethnic. So yeah, I just wanted to push back on that. Like
I have to take that as a full criticism because that is true. And it's weird because colorism is everywhere. So I don't. I'll put it this way. That's probably more of a little bit too American-centric take, even for me. But there's a level where I do think it's true, in that I don't think you get the idea that white people are codified people, if you want to put it in that way, without the United States, because we kind of made that happen. You can blame the Canadians too.
What white means in the United States is sort of a constantly shifting thing.
It's aloof.
It's kind of one of my favorite. There's this great podcast a couple years back called Stumptown or what have you. Not Stumptown. Sorry, it was Crime Town. That's what it was. And it was about Providence. They had a season on Providence and the phenomenally corrupt mayor of Providence. But there was this point before he became famous for beating his ex-wife's boyfriend with a Duraflame log or what have you. He was briefly a really up and coming figure in national politics because he was an Italian who voted for the Republicans. And that was mind blowing in 1980. And they have this clip of his. So he basically, Barack Obama's famous 2004 speech sort of launched him. I think he got that spot at the 1980 Republican convention. And they had a clip of his speech talking about, and I'm here to say that, us ethnic voters can vote for Republicans too, or something. And I was just 40 years ago, Italians were ethnic, which is, it's a constantly shifting. I think the Democrats have famously humiliated themselves, but also the Republicans. I think the Republicans and the Democrats have really been pushing this idea of a post post-majority United States for the past 20 years because it's useful to each of them, and it's always been just a ridiculous joke. All you have to do is like read the census definition of Latino, and you're like, wait a second. This like the fundamental argument about like census and demographics and like electoral futures of Republican and Democratic parties pushed by both of them is complete nonsense. It's just nonsense. And it has been very satisfying to see that come to fruition. As much as I would prefer the Democrats to be winning, it is kind of funny watching sort of charismatic Latinos sort of wipe the floor with CIA Democrats. Even though I'd prefer, I'd prefer the Democrats in charge. It's still really satisfying. I'm just taking my W's as the cruise ship sinks.
Fair. As a Democrat, you gotta take the W's where you can get them. Honestly.
Well, I wouldn't call myself a Democrat. I just don't want.
Yeah, I'm calling myself a Democrat. But yes.
But I just I've paid too much attention for the past 12 years of Republican governance, and it ain't good, folks. But anyway, we're not great politics.
Yeah, I do want to ask you a little bit about contemporary politics, but I want to give it a historical spin, and that is we do definitely see that the political parties change, right? You get new issues, voters eventually change, whether it's demographic data, labor rights, any of this stuff. And for me, I absolutely was of the conclusion years ago, even before I figured out who Zeihan was, that we were getting ready for like a political shift. The last time it even remotely happened, I would say, is in the 70s and 80s. With Reagan, you get the Reagan Revolution, but you had so many people who were Democrat that were one-off shots for Reagan, right? Reagan and then Democrat all the way down.
Oh, it was Nixon first. Reagan really ran Nixon.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. Like whether you talk about LBJ, Nixon, like it was a slower transitional shift, but you definitely have seen it, and I think we're here again. And so when people go, oh, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, I do have to ask a lot of people right now, what does it mean to be those? Because I think those are literally on the hyper track of changing. Donald Trump's Republican Party is not the same party of George Bush. I cannot consider it the same. I get that it's got some overlaps, it was basically hijacked by, Donald Trump. But the fact that you've got the business community looking at the Republican Party with some really weird eyes and be like, I don't know if this is my party anymore, kind of rings to me. The fact that you've got unions voting 60% in favor of Republicans, which was the core of the party for the Democrats under FDR, that rings to me. For me, I'm just wanting you to, putting this in a historical context, are historians going to say, yeah, this was the time when America was going through one of its great changes politically again?
100%. I've got a video I put up about 2 years ago called like Ronald Reagan versus the Joker, and just sort of saying, we had the FDR era that was tremendously successful in ways that crashed and burned in the 70s, and we had the Reagan era that was very successful in the 80s and 90s, and has just been crashing and burning for most of my adult life. And it's really just fascinating the degree to which it's an interesting month because all of us, after being settled for 40 years and just being something to whine about and, pretend we have different parties about, abortion is all of a sudden a thing again, but a real thing again. But largely the Democrats, obviously, and I think conceded by most in the case of the Clintons, but also I would argue in the case of Barack Obama, are just sort of Republican lights or Reaganites, fundamentally. And I think we've really gotten to a point where we have two parties of the rich. I 100% believe that Trump's rhetoric and the rhetoric of some other Republicans is beginning to steer in a different direction. J.D. Vance specifically. But there's zero meat on that. Working man's President Trump, went in and gave another massive fucking handout to the rich people. And so yeah, we've got different marketing schemes, which is what we've had for the past 40 years. Though I think in a saner context is different marketing for different kinds of rich people parties. But really, it's just it just seems like nobody in Washington D.C. has That's not true. I mean, there are I think there are people with constructive ideas in Washington D.C., but there's nobody there who remembers that the government can do anything other than sort of pat business people on the back and cheer them on. And the rhetoric's changing, no question, but I have not seen anybody back that up.
Good sign. Good sign. Everything that was just said.
I have to sign that too. It's because I do see the rhetoric changing on both fronts for both parties. But yeah, I'm not seeing the meat on the bone change. And I 1,000% have to give it that Donald Trump talked a lot about helping out the little guy. And I'm not going to get into the issue itself, but whether you think tariffs are right, that 20% tariff here or there wasn't a lot when it came down to it. When you're talking about East Asia, who subsidize the living crap out of everything they make, and then you gave one of the largest tax cuts in human history, whether you like that or not. On the other side, Democrats went from the party of Barack Obama, which was, I'm going to say, somewhat tolerant, somewhat more liberal, and has now become the progressive party where you get canceled if you don't say the right things. And that's been more of a shock to me than anything, is that the fact that, I'm going to put it this way, and I know this is still contemporary, so if we need to back off of it, we can, but the fact that the Democrats have gone for a more progressive rhetoric where they will back up a lot of these talking points that they wouldn't have 10 years ago blows my mind. And it's weird because I'm seeing two things. I'm seeing the Progressive Caucus do better, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, those folks, but also the business community looking at Democrats in a far more beneficial way, I guess. People talk about Biden being the corporate Democrat, that kind of thing. This party seems almost completely incoherent to me now. How do you make a party with progressives and socialists work with business leaders? Does that work? So
when was the Republican or Democratic Party ever really that coherent? I mean, you've got the Clintons, Democratic Leadership Council, working directly with the unions that they were probably doing more than anybody to undermine. The Republicans, had a bunch of sort of East Coast elite types, with zero problems with gays or abortions, hand in hand, skipping down the street with, the Falwells of the world. I mean, I don't think they've ever been particularly coherent. But I agree, you're right. No, you're totally right in that, we are reaching a level of incoherence that indicates that, totally. If everything's up in the air, we're just looking for figures that are capable of defining what's there.
Gotcha. So, last question, which is contemporary but also historical. I'm not going to throw any names out here, but I do think one way or another we're going to see another great leader emerge from this mess. Whether it's just kind of like historical paradigms, that everything that I'm looking at, for me, looks like this is literally just a few years before the next FDR or Reagan or whoever the big name is going to be, because humanity in particular, but Americans go through this level of chaos. We did have the Great Depression. We did have World War II. We had World War I. We had the Civil War. There is big names out there for people who kind of retooled the system and made it work for a whole new group of people. And as much as people like to be downer on the United States, and I get why, I have a hard time doing it because we are so damn good at reinventing ourselves when push comes to shove. And that's kind of where I think, if you're going to put this in a historical context where we're looking at this 20 years from now or 30 years from now, I don't know, maybe I'm just a little heart aching for my fellow Americans here, but I think the table's about to turn somewhere. I just don't know where.
100% agree on, we're in a period of flux that's just waiting on probably a president. I mean, it's typically how it works to take advantage. And I remember in 2017, being legitimately terrified. I was like, if Trump, I think Bannon had a plan, and I think that if Trump had gone for that whole hog, we'd have a very different country organized along very different lines that I would have personally found pretty troubling. Luckily, by my lights, Trump turned out to be completely incompetent. But then I had with Biden, I was like, okay, and I think people were writing stuff 2 years ago. Oh, look, it's a new FDR, and I was like, I'm kind of open to this now. I was much more right wing before Trump got elected. I'm kind of open to this now, and he's proved to completely whiff as well, I mean, maybe we need a president who's under, 80. Maybe that would help.
Perhaps.
Yeah, but we're totally in a moment where, somebody who's got, some kind of, it's just, but I feel like Reagan built to that for decades. He was the man who had crafted his image, and he was ready for that moment. He'd been working on it for decades. FDR, less so, but he was, he had political, I mean, who's that figure? Who's that figure who...
I think we're going to get I want to put it out there. I think we're going to see someone who's far more like Lincoln, somebody who's, kind of new, kind of fresh, but has an idea and sells it to people. Because quite honestly, who else is it?
I actually think that it's going to depend on the timing, right? I think we can't see no one can resolve this the way it is right now. We have to have the system actually have a collapse in order for there to be someone there to save it.
I do want to point out that I think I do agree with what is it, the Friedman book, said, this is the storm before the calm or what have you. I think gets a little too mystical with the cycles, but I think I agree with that general. I agree with Zeihan's idea that the U.S. is by far best positioned to survive, whatever comes, but we are in a world with nuclear weapons, and I think it's very easy to sort of sit here and say, we'll be fine. I almost certainly we will be, but I do think I wish we would, and I think this is actually something Zeihan talks about a lot. I wish we would take a little more responsibility for the world, but no president has been interested in that since the first Bush. Because this Russia thing is pretty it's a lot, and I think we could totally pull it off. We could totally crush Russia here, but we're not prioritizing. We're not focusing on that. We're we got to still be angry at Iran, and we got to still be,
or we have to worry about inflation at home, or else the Democrats will get beaten in the election, or we gotta, tell the Federal Reserve that they have to destroy demand to code for recession creation, right? All this stuff that is going on right now that is competing priorities that are in conflict with each other, about whether or not we can maintain this system without catastrophic failure. I feel like it needs to code red, and then there needs to be someone to rush in with the paddles and be clear. And what that looks like is taking the U.S. to 300% of GDP in debt, to just max that out, so that we're all the working people are taken care of, and the rich people lose all their assets, and we just reset everything. And that's what I think it would take.
I feel like that wouldn't work out very well, Sam.
Why not?
I just think that's a little. Well, I mean, I don't know. I would be pissed if all my investments disappeared. But
that's what happened during the Great Depression. Everybody, all these rich people lost their money.
A fair amount of rich people lost their money. It's not all the rich people did not.
There were some winners, right? What's his name? Kennedy made he started out as a multimillionaire, and he ended up being one of the most dominant players in finance by the end of the Depression.
There are there's a lot there. There's the one point that I wanted to make is that you shouldn't sleep on the possibility of the entire international scene spinning entirely out of control. I've always been of the mind that this idea that World War III is tomorrow is nonsense. Frankly, the United States at this point is way too powerful for Russia, China, everyone together. 30 years from now, it's a different story. But the thing is, Putin has made this gamble, and China, so far, has decided not to back it.
Yes.
whatever, blah, blah, blah. I think something I just made a video about this week, sadly a kind of crappy unproduced one, but like we are perpetually on the cusp of falling into it with Iran. And if we've fallen into it with Iran, the chances of like, oops, we lost an aircraft carrier are pretty high. And like, if the US is fighting Iran and Russia, China's calculus about Taiwan shifts. So like, World War III? Well, yeah, actually, technically. And the chances, there's always a chance. I mean, we have the history from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s of, there's that heroic Russian who, didn't end the world over the computer bug, like that shit's always possible.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but I don't think the baby boomers are like smarter or better at anything than the greatest generation was, like,
no.
I think like you can make arguments that like George H.W. Bush was, a little terrifying in a lot of ways. You look at some of personal history, but that motherfucker was competent, like there were people who knew what they were doing. And I don't have that feeling about Washington, D.C. right now. And I don't have that feeling about, China is a place that was like, seemed like it was run competently, 10, 15 years ago. Now, they're going neo-Mao. And it's like the chances of the world ending accidentally
Are up.
tomorrow are non-zero.
Yeah.
So yeah, I 100% believe like the United States is gonna like, is like the likely winner out of any continued chaos. We've got the resources, we've got the this, that, and the other thing. But like people are sort of sleeping on the fact that it totally could all end tomorrow.
That's a debilitating thought.
That last thought was kind of where I was wanting to go. So we're just over an hour, and I want to take the last 30 minutes, if you would give us that, to kind of like tour around the world, continent by continent, and kind of exchange predictions on where at least this general area is going. Because I think that's a pretty good way to wrap this up. Get people on my community familiar with who you are and what you're thinking, and then likewise if you put anything up on your end. So let's start with the easy one. Let's start with home in North America. What do you think is going to be unfolding, let's say, over the next 20 years?
Like if I make predictions, oh, sorry.
Yeah, you cut out there for a second, but you're good now.
Okay. Yeah, I tend to be very, very cautious with my predictions. But what do I say? What can I say about North America? I can tell you that there will be no civil war. I can tell you that almost certainly 20 years from now, there will be a Democratic and a Republican Party. And they will be substantially different from what they are today. I have hopes, but like, I just don't, and I think we'll probably be better off than we are today. I think we'll probably still be a destination for folks. I think we'll probably still be the most powerful country in the world. I'm actually cautiously optimistic about Mexico. If the U.S. can just sort out our weird drug pathologies and the laws that we've imposed south of the border, I think leftists, more and more angry leftists getting elected in Latin America should help us with that if we have any self-reflection. And yeah, if we can just get Mexico would already be in like sort of a Turkey, sort of Malaysia situation if it weren't for fucking U.S. drug laws. So yeah, I guess that's I hope that's useful for North America. Nothing too firm there.
Yeah, I get you. What do you got, Sam?
I feel like it's going to be, as regions go, pretty stable comparatively. And I agree that the U.S. power is going to continue, most likely. And, I think that it's going to be the most stable continent in the world, basically.
Gotcha. My thoughts are pretty straightforward. I'm gonna bet on the U.S. because we've got to literally do everything wrong to get it to make it happen. We can muck up a few. Huh?
Which we've been doing for the past 2 decades, but
well, as bad as we've been, like it could be a lot worse. I'm not gonna dissuade from that. But when it comes down to it, yeah, we're gonna have to pick up our act a little bit if we're gonna want a good future. But even just sliding by with kind of like meh, I think it's still very much on the table unless we literally just do everything wrong. So I'm still holding out. Like USA is going to do at least okay, and I think that's a pretty good bet. Mexico can go right now either way. I'm seeing a lot of good movements on some sides where you're seeing a rising middle class. You're seeing more political transparency, particularly with the defanging of the PRI over the last 20 years. That was a tremendous help because they were literally selling entire sections of the country off to the cartel. That's not a good way to run a functional government. When it comes down to anywhere in North America that's a trouble spot, I've got three. Central America is problematic and coming with the future famine conditions that we're probably going to see towards the end of the year. Keep an eye on that. Number two is Cuba, because they might to some degree pull a Venezuela. I can't say that one way or another, but Cuba's kind of on some shaky ground with their wonderful leadership. And the last one's actually Canada. Canada looks a lot like Europe in the regards that they'll be able to hang on to the United States being in proximity, but it's an old folks' home. And so for me, looking at Canada is, I'm not going to say like Canada's going to openly dissolve, but Canada's going to have a real identity crisis when they can't pay for half the things that they've been used to being able to pay for. I really want to see what the Canadians do, because I totally could see the Plains provinces saying, screw it, we're going to be American. And that would make me very happy to put a couple more stars on the flag. But I know that's shaky, but yeah, go ahead, sir.
I feel like you're not going to give up that healthcare, man.
I don't think they're going to be able to afford it, if I'm looking at my numbers right. You're seeing the Canadians at the richest part of their tax base right now, and then you're going to see in about 10 years that tax base move into mass retirement, slowly but surely. 20 years down the road, you're going to have one worker for every retiree in Canada. Does that system work like that? I don't know. I don't think it will.
Doesn't Canada have mass immigration?
They're trying to, but they've never been able to pull the numbers that the Americans have, because they don't share a direct border with anybody. You got to fly to Canada.
Over the past 5 years.
Don't get me wrong. I will happily double check my census data, but I just did I just did a presentation on my channel with demography. It'll actually be out on the YouTube here in about 3 or 4 days, and it kind of goes down, gives a little world tour. Whether it is immigration, birth rate, or both combined, Canada has dropped the population between its 40-year-olds and its basically its newborns by over 30%. That's a hit. So we'll have to see where that breaks down.
And corrected.
Okay. Europe. This one's going to be spicy. I'm very curious what you think the future of Europe is, Robert.
I've spent so much of my life being very anti. I mean, for lack of a better word, I've been sort of a super neoliberal, and I read my Economist cover to cover, for 20 years, and was like, the French, they just, they're screwing everything up. They're not, opening their economy the way the British do and the Germans did, and they're the worst. The French, those dumb hippies, they're just And man, I look at the French now in the context of this. To be clear, I'm very angry about what the French still does in West Africa. But I look at what the French positioning in relation to the new European world, and they have nuclear plants. I'm sure that the nuclear plants were not the appropriate neoliberal thing to maintain. Those should have been opened up and privatized and never been built again the way we do it in the United States. But yeah, no, I don't know. I've found myself questioning. I mean, Donald Trump getting elected. I mean, I was a standard, never actually a Republican, but a standard, neoliberal, yeah, business, yeah, Reaganite, until that morning in November 2016, and it's thrown a whole bunch of stuff up. So I feel like there's a lot of real standard things that I believe about Europe. I have been. With the refugee crisis that the U.S. created in Syria in 2015, I was like, well, that's it. Europe's on death watch. The EU's over. Sorry, nothing we can do about it. It's over. And, it just keeps limping on. I know that Europe's demographic situation is garbage. I know that Europe has failed to innovate. I mean, you just look at, 10 years ago, well, I guess it's 15 years ago now, where like the biggest companies in the world were a selection of U.S. and European banks. And you look at the biggest companies in the world today, and it's all U.S. tech companies and Chinese oil companies, and there is no European. So I'm totally conscious and like totally on board with like the standard critiques of like they're dying out, museum continent. Like I've been spouting those for 20 years. But also like I don't know, man. Like maybe I'm wrong. I was wrong about a lot of stuff. So yeah, one thing that I've said, I made this video about 8 years ago, which is that Russia will join the European Union within 30 years. So I've got about 22 years on that prediction, and I gotta say, the Putin regime invading Ukraine kind of accelerates that timeline. So I think it's entirely possible. I don't know if we'll have an EU specifically in 30 years, but I do think that whatever's left of Russia will be Europe aligned in 22 years. I'm not saying that.
That's very interesting. All right, what do you got, Sam?
I mean, I'm bullish on France. I'm bullish on Poland. Just sweeping up the remnants of Russia. We'll see how that works out, though. I'm not very confident about that. I'm bullish on... Interested to hear Robert's opinion on this, because I'm not an expert on this, but on Turkey and their expansion possibly into Bulgaria again and Greece. And I think there's going to just be a lot of conflict. I don't think there's going to be a lot of peace in Europe moving forward. That's my current belief, but not an expert.
Gotcha. As for me, I think there's a lot of people that I think are kind of right about this, but I'll put it in this term. I expect that the next 20 years will be kind of known as a pan-European schism. Europe is going to have to figure out what its identity is going on in the future, whether it's going to go back to more of what we see in the past with hyper-nationalism of like France and Germany and all these other folks, or if you're going to see kind of like a pan-European identity kind of rise from the ashes of that. I don't think this is actually incredibly un-European. We can talk about the 30 Years' War. We can talk about the rise or the Napoleonic Revolutionary Wars. Like every now and again, and we're kind of on due for this, as about every 200 years, Europe has this massive pan-continental schism that everybody gets a part of, and they completely rewrite the rules for how Europe's going to operate. And it totally makes sense in this environment to do that again, and I hate that because it's usually like bloody and gory and nasty. But the future that Europe's looking at, if they don't have a complete course correction one way or another, looks really rough. I don't think you can keep the European going in the way that it has been, because I think it's largely dominated by American interests and basically propped up with NATO. And the European model is not a federal model; it's confederal. And they're gonna either have to knit that thing together, or they're gonna have to have people go different ways. And either which one of those winning out is going to be a huge different trajectory. But I think that's the question that the Europeans are going to have to answer: is that do they want to go one path, or do they want to go back to their multiple paths? So that's my thoughts on Europe.
Can I just make one point?
Like,
I totally agree that looking at it now, you're like, yeah, Europe is going on a more militarized, more violent path. But it's just like, again, these were choices. Like, this did not have to happen this way. Like, looking at the Middle East, which is something that I do primarily, like, that was entirely a choice largely made by the United States. That, like, if you looked at, like Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, in 2010, they were actually talking about like a Schengen zone, like a visa-free, like I had friends who lived in there in that period. It was lovely. You sort of tour around, this, that, and the other thing. And like, yeah, we made a choice to fund a bunch of jihadists to kill a country. And like that, the knock-on effects of that, including Brexit, including like, have just been like so atrocious. But like, these were choices. Like, we don't need to do this. And I think it's entirely possible that like the knock-on effects of that terrible decision we made will, end up catapulting Europe back into war and destruction. But none of this was necessary. Like the whole Turkey thing, like Turkey is taking territory back in Syria. I mean, that's it. You can't. 6 years later, their temporary incursion into Syria yeah. I mean, that they're not leaving, and they'll probably take some more. That may have been a sort of secret aspect of the Finland-Sweden deal that nobody really complains if they go back into Syria. Obviously, everyone's going to condemn it, but maybe they'll take they'll just to add a little bit more. I don't think, just to answer your question real quick, I don't see a real chance of them going into Bulgaria unless Bulgaria or Greece, unless both the EU and NATO are completely disintegrate. And I think the Turks see enough scope in taking back slices of the Middle East that is interesting and attractive to them without throwing out the cover of NATO. And entirely something that could fall apart.
You're probably right.
Yeah, Greece, just because they hate each other. People with identical.
Yeah, they need those islands, man.
Yeah. Well, that too. Yeah, that's a good point. But yeah, but I mean, it's just people with identical. I lived in Turkey for 6 years, and just folks with identical cuisines, and a lot of very similar aspects of the culture. Just
very
loathe each other.
Well, they have very good reasons on both sides.
So what you're saying is reclaim Constantinople. That's what I'm.
That probably wouldn't go very well.
I'm joking, but I want to move to. Go ahead.
Tried.
Say what?
Lloyd George tried.
I don't think I know that reference.
The British Prime Minister sort of sponsored the Greek invasion of Turkey after World War
I. Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is where Mustafa Kemal marched the Greeks out of the country. That's an amazing story. That we should cover that sometime, Ty. That's an amazing story.
I know parts of it, but like the rise of Ataturk and basically the Turkey post World War I is a quagmire. And I know some bits of it, but I don't know enough of it to be like, all right, yeah, this is what happened, and then this is what happened.
I'll just give you the short of it. And the guy became the leader of the Turkish military, such as it was, which didn't even exist really at that point, because he refused to recognize the Sultan's order to stand down and let the Europeans turn them into a colony. And because of that, he was branded a traitor. And so he what happened was his own enemies within the nationalist movement in Turkey were like, okay, you got to march the Greeks out, or else we're gonna you got to win against the Greeks, or else we're gonna execute you. Like, his own people were doing that, and he was like, okay, and he literally just did it. It's amazing. It's an amazing story of someone who was up against enemies within his own group and also without, and then just when all the chips were down and needed to personally deliver, just succeeded so wildly that nobody expected it, basically.
It's incredible folly and tragedy on the Greek side. Well,
yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, we gotta do a roundup.
Yeah, we're
getting
moving on next. We'll move on to North Asia, aka Russia in particular, or if you want to call it the former Soviet Union, so we can get into Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. I'll make this pretty quick for myself. I think Russia is not going to disintegrate, but it's going to wither on the vine for the next 30 years, probably, if not more. And what Russia's big deal is not going to be looking outward, even though they're going to have to deal with whatever the Europeans decide to do in their schism. Russia's going to have a serious problem policing the people internally. We're talking the Northern Caucasus peoples, and particularly the Tatars. I think that's the future of North Asia, is that you're going to see it kind of be broken down into civil strife, where basically anyone who is ruled does not want to be ruled anymore. And I'm gonna say this, and it's gonna be really sad, but the Russo-Ukrainian war probably starved out most of the stands this year and over the next year. That's the primary area that gets both Russian and Ukrainian grain. So yeah, what happens to the Uzbeks and the Tajiks whenever they don't have food? So I'm not looking at a really great future for them, literally just in the next 2 years, let alone the next 20. After that, it's basically handling a collapsing Russia. I could totally see a second Soviet collapse kind of style thing where, yeah, you literally have some of the autonomous regions just break away, say, we're done. The central authority in Moscow no longer has that control. I don't think that's going to be in the next 5 years, but I could totally see it in, in the next 15, 20. So, Robert.
Yeah, that I think that's a horrifying potential prospect. I mean, just the most important aspect of the U.S.-Russian relationship, I would argue far more important for humanity than whatever happened to Ukraine or Poland or whatever, was the disposition of the Russian nuclear arsenal. In the aftermath of the Cold War, the U.S. had the money to sort of break up and get rid of a lot of our nuclear weaponry, and we heavily funded and coordinated with the Russian state in doing the same for them. All of that cooperation ended in 2014. Terrifying. Which means the chances of something just sort of falling off the wagon, this, that, and the other thing. Probably not a fully functioning warhead. But dirty bombs galore, that sort of thing. Fruits of the U.S.-Ukraine plan will be the first dirty bomb explosions in probably some Western capital. Not because Russia. If Russia disintegrates, then it's just the nightmare of nuclear terrorism that we were also concerned about in 2002, 2003 becomes very, very real. I think that's a distinct possibility, and that's really king scary. I'm sad to say that you think that the Uzbekistan is gonna starve to death. I was just there actually. It's a phenomenal place. I highly recommend visiting. I need to do a dive into some of the stuff about food. I'd love it if you could recommend some resources. That'd be great.
I'll simply say I'd have to compile data about this. Actually, Zeihan's baiting me on this one. He's got some graphs and some nice stuff on it. But generally, in the overwhelming thing that I've seen, Russia has been the primary grain supplier to most of Central and South Asia. And with most of those going to be cut off because they couldn't get fertilizer or they can't export, all of these are very likely and very much on the table. I think you're going to see what we would call the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia make Arab Spring look like a joke. Probably next year, actually. That's sad and scary as hell to me, but also, this is geopolitics when you have wars again. So the one thing I'll say about the Uzbeks, which, I'm not an expert in that field or these peoples, but everyone that I talk to who is kind of an expert in the region tells me they seem to have a better prospect of being like the next great peoples in the area than any other group. More than the Kazakhs or the Tajiks or anyone else. Go ahead.
Kidding about the way that I believe it was, I don't know if it was Stalin or went back to the Tsars, is the way that they divvied it up is that when the Russian military limped into that area in the 1860s, 1870s, there were three great khanates that were just terrible, just shadows of what was happening before the Portuguese figured out how to do an end run around the Silk Road. There were three sort of things that Russia conquered there, and they put all of the capitals of that territory within Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan is vastly more populated than the other stands, has the majority, made out like bandits. So it makes sense that Uzbekistan would be the future because, a lot of the other places, they're all designed to fail, but Uzbekistan got the lion's share of the worthwhile.
I largely agree with that. I mean, Samarkand was once the capital of, Tamerlane or Timor-Link or whatever name you want to go with him because he had 50 of them. So let's move on to South Asia or West Asia, aka the Middle East, because that's a meltdown box for me. Is that depending on who we're talking about, this can go either very badly or very poorly, or very well. If you want me to go first, I will. If you're biting on this one, feel free to hit it, because I have to collect my thoughts and simply say that The Turks look the best in the region. The Saudis are probably playing on borrowed time because they are an oil exporting economy only. The Persians, if they can get their crap together, probably can really put the region back together again. But that's also in the fact that everyone hates them. So, like, it's so weird because I'm looking at it literally in the next couple of years, famine conditions in certain areas because they can't get the food because their primary supplier is offline due to a war. But also, whenever this breaks down to where you're going to see the wars of conflict that are going to blow up from that. And yes, I expect Iran and the Saudis to go after it, or after it probably next year, actually. Don't get me wrong, that's a shot, but if people are itching for food, I think that fight's going to happen. And if that fight does happen, the Saudis have the money, they have the allies, aka moreover maybe the U.S., but definitely Israel is now pretty much on Team Saudi. That's a hard nut to crack, but the Persians have the state apparatus. They actually know how to get a military to fight in the desert without air conditioning. If I had to put bets, I'd say Iran, but this could go sideways for everybody so quickly. So simply, I'm going to put it that over the next 5 years, I expect the Middle East to be a hellstorm. It's just whoever can pick up the pieces afterward, and I'm going to say that's 20 years down the road, is probably going to be not one of the great powers, but one of the major regional powers. And if I'm going to just throw a bet, it's either going to be the Turks or the Persians. So that's where I'm at.
I think the Middle East, everything depends on whether the United States can finally be persuaded to leave those poor people alone. It's just like, people just what we're doing to Syria today is nightmarish. I mean, we're looking at it's terrible that Russia is blocking food exports. Yeah, well, we've essentially been doing that to Syria for a decade. They refused to get rid of the president that we wanted to get rid of. So we are mercilessly punishing that entire country, and the contagion is spreading. Lebanon don't get me wrong, Lebanon had many of its own problems. Lebanon deeply, talk about designed to fail. The miraculous thing about Lebanon is that it has existed for as long as it has. However, one of the main reasons that Lebanon is falling into and finding it impossible to get out of its current crisis. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but they've gone from the potential for middle class for some parts of their population to everybody's savings being wiped out because their central bank was a Ponzi scheme, and the U.S. refuses to let Lebanon fire the central banker who was in charge of that. So Lebanon absolutely falling to pieces because of our Syria policy. Jordan, about as unobjectionable and U.S. compliant ally, a country as you can imagine for decades. Works well with Israel, just like our guys all the way. That's a real potential for just falling apart because we refuse to let Syrians eat. It's horrific what we've done to that country and continue to do to that country. It's insane. If we wanted to really, win the war in Ukraine instead of use it as a stalemate to double down on arming Europe, we would be allowing people to buy oil from Iran. I think that it's hard to imagine a future for the Middle East where the U.S. just continues to stick its dick in, as we will continue to do. Mm-hmm. I think if the U.S. eventually did pull out, I think that the chances of the Arab world falling back to its status quo pre-Europe are disturbingly high, which means getting fought over by Turks and Persians. And you know what? The best hope for the Arabs in that point would make the alliance that they had in full fruition in all its greatest periods, Umayyad Spain, etc., which is Arabs plus Jews, and which, though I find the implementation and the approach of the Abraham Accords to be atrocious, doing deals with what the Abraham Accords did to Sudan is one of the greatest crimes of the century. But anyway, that, if we actually had decent governments in the Arab world, I think that the Arab world teaming up with Israel is like possibly the only chance the Arabs have to avoid falling under Turkish and Persian subjection again. The problem is none of this is possible. None of this is possible if the United States continues to
muck about.
It continues to shore up the absolutely worst, most disgusting elements available, which are the literal medieval monarchies.
Yeah.
Like the slave owners that founded our country would be disgusted with us. Disgusted that we are the people keeping medieval monarchy alive. Like they have, and they'd be right. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington have unimpeachable moral authority over Washington, D.C. right now, even as slave owners, because we are keeping monarchy alive. Like we're pissing on the Enlightenment.
Are you're talking about Riyadh right now, or the Emirates, or both?
Well, I think the Emirates and Qatar are like somewhat more. I mean, those aren't countries; they're like landing strips. Saudi Arabia specifically, like it's truly it really. I mean, maybe I've made this clear, but it really chaps my hand. You know. So anyway, sorry. I think there's a chance that the United States will still be just fucking over the Middle East again 20 years from now, and that'll still be the story, and it'll still be the place where the Cold War never ended, and it'll just get worse and worse. That's entirely possible.
I hope we're done.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, it would. So let's move to South Asia. We're largely talking about the Indian subcontinent here, but we can definitely get into a little bit of Southeast Asia. But basically, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Holy crap. This is a powder keg, and I hate it, but there's a level where Bangladesh is largely propped up by India, so I don't think like they're going anywhere, and India's got some problems to deal with, but I think they're actually they're not incompetent. I'm actually quite impressed with India as what they've been able to do since the 1980s. They're not doing the rampant growth that China's had that is unstable. It's a lot more solid, a lot more grounded. And so for me is that they're going to have to make some deals with some people they don't like to get oil in the coming years, but if they can do that, they've got a future. What scares me is Pakistan. Pakistan is a state that I quite honestly think that should never have existed, and I'm not saying that from like a moral or objective perspective. It's more of like, how did you make a desert country of 200 million stay afloat? It is really kind of how this works. Their entire northern border isn't secure. It's basically a nether zone where Pakistan and Afghanistan really just kind of blend together. The only thing that really unites Pakistan is its hatred and Muslim identity against India. And I don't think that lasts much longer, particularly if food becomes a consideration or they don't have a sponsor in the form of China there for whatever reason. I do not see a good future for Pakistan, and this is one of the major nuclear armed states of the world who has a grudge with its neighbors. I'm not going to say this could end very horribly, but I think it ends badly somehow, some way. Few rogue nuclear weapons, or because Pakistan collapsed, or because Pakistan threw the gauntlet down and either attacked India or Iran or both, because they hate them both. So I know that sounds a little bit out of the glass cannon for some people, but the fact that Pakistan's still there actually still blows my mind. So I'll just wrap that up as where I'm at right there.
I'm going to say is that I'm don't have humility on much, but I have a lot of humility on India and Pakistan. Like, like whenever I try, I mean, I've read books and books and books, but it's just, I'm just like, this is another world here. You know, it's got the complexity of and the dynamics of an entire world within that subcontinent. So yeah,
True.
I don't know, man. But on Pakistan, I just want to push back a little bit. And this is something that I really dislike about Zeihan's approach to things. It's like, I think the world has changed in dramatic ways since industrialization. And I think you just look at Pakistan from 1947. I don't know what Pakistan's literacy rates are, but I can tell you from 1947 to 2020, they've improved markedly. Mm-hmm. And like, I think that Pakistan, whatever ridiculous reasons to found a country, you could argue there's, I don't know if you'd ever want to rank those. That'd be a good way to get canceled off the internet entirely. But like, there are a lot of countries with some really ridiculous reasons for existing. Pakistan is a country that has existed for 70 years.
Right.
And yeah, like it sucks for Pakistan that they basically like became instantiated as like the guaranteed loser in a civilizational conflict, with India. I mean, like it's just like, it's like, I mean, can you imagine like there being like a tiny little North China, like imagine Manchukuo became independent with like a tenth of the size of China and was like, fuck you, China! Like, yeah, it's just, I mean, well, essentially a larger Taiwan. Yeah. Like imagine like Pakistan is a larger Taiwan. And like, they got a really crappy set of cards. And were a big part in helping us destroy the Soviet Union, in part by U.S. heavily funding and supporting exactly that warping of the Pakistani public sphere into like this. I mean, Pakistan, unlike almost every other Muslim country, like their religious nationalism and like corruption of Sunni Islam isn't as exclusively Wahhabi as it is in every other Muslim country, isn't exclusively paid for by Americans paying for Saudi oil, paying for radicalism. I mean, Pakistan, it is more homegrown there, but like than it is in really any other Sunni Muslim country. But like, I don't know. I was excited to see Imran Khan get like pushed out of office in a plausibly constitutional way, rather than just getting assassinated or, turfed out by the generals, which is the standard way that prime ministers get handled in Pakistan. So like, I don't know, like I firmly believe that there can be progress everywhere. I think that there are absolutely demographic and trade flow things that militate against success for a lot of countries. But I think that if we do get to this sort of post-American world that Zeihan and others talk about, like, I think a lot of countries could surprise us with their durability and their resilience. Nationalism is a powerful thing, in a positive sense as well as a negative sense. And yet, no question, like, there's a lot of things about, like, the, quality of life in the Middle East or the Stands or Pakistan that are going to change, but that doesn't necessarily mean everything's going to fall apart, which I think is something that, if I had a main critique of Zeihan's,
I'm gonna, yeah.
It's all fucked. It's all fucked without Big Daddy America.
Yeah, I'm gonna take that because one of my biggest criticisms of the Europeans is that they haven't really embraced their identity as what what their history has made them into. In fact, like the better part of the last 70 years has largely been the rejection of anything Europeanism by the Europeans, which is kind of weird. So for me.
Like conquering shit?
Yeah, like conquering shit. No, actually, I'm going to say moreover is what really kind of set the Europeans apart is that they were militarized. They did have a strong like personal identity, whether it was German, whether it was French, whether it was Spanish. And they've largely been whittling that away since the better part of 45, but really got ramped up after 1991. It's almost like the Europeans got the idea that history was over after 1991. So the one thing I'll say is that logistically speaking and administratively speaking, like Pakistan confuses the fuck out of me. But if Pakistan's going to win or survive, like I kind of agree with you. You're looking at a situation where they, or I'll put it this way. I'm not saying you said this, but for Pakistan to really thrive and do well, you're going to have like a Mughals 2.0 where they kind of flood back into India and like get control of the continent again.
Has to accept its role as India's Canada, which is essentially impossible. But yeah, it's. I think with a lot of like Imran Khan stuff, there was another flare up between Pakistan and India, and like what's interesting about Imran Khan is he wants to bitch about America more than he wants to bitch about India, which I think is very savvy. Because I think with Imran Khan and the one there was a big flare up. I think you were seeing a consciousness that. Yeah, I think Imran Khan, unlike prior, Pakistani leaders, was like, yeah, we can't win this. I think that realization will continue to grow, hopefully. I don't know. Or it could all burn down.
Yeah, right. Sam, we've kind of left you there in the tail lights there. So if you want to get in on this, definitely.
No, I'm enjoying listening. I don't have a whole lot to add about specific country profiles. I don't have that level of expertise to really contribute that much to it.
That's fine.
Can I say something on India?
Yeah.
Like, I am real concerned about, there's like this sort of like, very PC, very human rights, very concerned about how screwed over Muslims are everywhere. Part of me that is very worried about some of the steps that
Modi
is taking, sort of Hindutva stuff. But there's balanced against it. It's also just like, he's kind of doing Europe in the 40s. He's just like, he's very European in his approach, in that I think he's crafting an Indian identity, which might have been something that they were missing. And it's horrifying. That's a horrifying prospect for the 160 odd Muslims in India, and something that I think as an international community we should be on the lookout for. But also I think it might be not an essential. These are all choices, but I think it is a very recognizable and sort of European style trajectory that India is on, that will probably lead to great horrors. There are already concentration camps of sorts, but might also lead to India's trajectory, getting a little faster, which is a pretty disgustingly Machiavellian way to look at the prospect of concentration camps. But yeah, no. Like I said, I'm just throwing out ideas there about India.
I know, at least from my end, that they've always had deals with like ethno-linguistics, where all these different peoples are kind of meshed together, and some people get preferential treatment, some people don't. I can't speak to anything about concentration camps, but I can definitely say that even to this day, everyone tells me they're still struggling with the caste system. Even though they've officially like disbarred it, like it's still... We know where you live. We know who your family was. It's weird because I don't understand it in a land of 1.3 billion people, how anyone remembers whose family is who, but apparently they still do, or at least that's what people tell me. So...
Yeah. I know, just to say on the concentration camps, that's not, like, I tend to overuse terms like that.
Mm-hmm.
My understanding is it's sort of resettlement camps for people that they're stripping of their citizenship, which is, I think, by my mind, technically a concentration camp, and kind of horrifying. But I'm not... Honestly, I haven't. I researched that for a video 2 years ago. It could be that was just Congress propaganda that was completely debunked, or it could be very real.
All right, let's try to rapid fire this off a little more. East Asia, this is largely Japan, China, the Koreas, and Taiwan. And I'll make this pretty quick. Japan is the oldest society on Earth, and the fact that they've been able to hold this thing together for 30 years after having consistent rolling recession is kind of impressive. Can they keep doing it? I don't know. Their demography says they've got about 10 years or 15 before they have the next group of people go into mass retirement, and then they have 2 retirees for every 1 worker. That environment says it doesn't work, but there's one thing about Japan. It's the size of California and has 3 times the population. So maybe depopulation would actually be a win for Japan, but that's a big out there. China should have never got as powerful as it was for almost every reason I can put up there. Whether it is the fact that they literally have legalized loan sharking, to the fact that Xi is basically gone neo-Mao and walled off everybody. The fact that China's still there blows my mind. Korea needs to figure out if they're going to be unified or not. If they do, they've got a fighting chance. If they don't, they're screwed. And I think that kind of wraps everything up. I don't think Taiwan's going to go anywhere anytime soon. I think they've got a nice thing working for them, and they're obviously not going to take over the mainland. So go for it.
Who says Taiwan's not going to take over the mainland?
Can we? Can we see that? That would be great.
There's a phenomenal book, Ghost Fleet, which is, I think, it's just a novel about U.S. fighting Taiwan, and I think in that world, what happens is the Chinese Communist Party disintegrates, and a bunch of Taiwanese politicians come in to save the day, and that's actually who the U.S. ends up losing the war to. And I think that's I think that's science fiction. But I don't think China's going to try it with Taiwan until they've got enough nuclear plants of their own, so they're not as dependent on oil and gas. I am not surprised that China is still there. I think that my read on Chinese history is very different. 100%, there's nonstop cycles of disintegration and whatnot, but and reconnection. But those cycles, those cycles tend to be longer than the whole history of the United States to this point. You got your Tang dynasties in there. You got some pretty good runs, and I really do think that industrialization changed something. I think that literacy changed something. I think we're in a context that it's the only countries we've seen fall apart in the post-Cold War period. I mean, Yugoslavia, but certainly the post-Cold War period are places that the U.S. has pushed. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's not a natural. I don't think that disintegration is a natural part of. I think things can get really, 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 really bad before somebody's like, what would make this better? Civil war. I don't think. I mean, I could be proven wrong, but I mean, Iraq, including President Brandon, everyone was like, oh yeah, we should probably just divvy it up. One of the worst videos I ever made was back in 2015. I was like, yeah, man, time to divvy up Iraq. And, somehow they just keep on going.
Right.
I just don't think, I think Lebanon is probably the country in the direst straits today, but it's not going to get divvied up. It's going to get swallowed up. Just the question is how, or by who. I don't see state disintegration. I'd see state disintegration as something to avoid. The biggest example we have is South Sudan, which was heavily encouraged by the United States. And we didn't mention it so much because it didn't reflect very well on us, but that was probably the worst war. Probably the worst war of the 21st century. Maybe I'm missing something.
Until the recent one.
Something on the lines of 500,000 people dead. And it should take Russia and Ukraine at least until the end of the year to get to 500,000 dead, right?
I don't know.
Not much more, not much further than the end of the year.
Yeah. The problem with the Russo-Ukrainian war, we're getting pretty good numbers from the Ukrainians, but we're not hearing crap out of the Russians. It's all estimates. And I've heard estimates now that the Russians have lost over 50,000 combatants in that, but we don't know. We can't verify it. Supposedly U.S. intelligence knows, but we don't. So
I would say that the poor man. The problem with the poor man's George W. Bush routine is that if you don't have the resources to pull it off the way Bush did, things get really nasty. It should be worse than Syria by the end of the year, I'd say for sure.
Absolutely.
Worse than 10 years of Syria.
So we hit Africa, or we talked a little bit of Africa and South Sudan. So let's move to Africa because it's a big continent. I'm not an expert in this continent. Go ahead.
I just have to say, we perpetually leave out Southeast Asia, which are a series of incredibly successful, stunning, Malaysia, Indonesia.
Yes.
Really, good things are happening, and that'd be nice. And I think the main risk there is China finally doing what the Pentagon wants and cooking up some proxy wars of their own. And that's the main risk to those tremendously successful countries. But I think hopefully they'll be able to surmount it. Burma, less so.
We did skip over that. I was just trying to prioritize, but I did want to touch this, and I'm glad you sent us back because this is actually a region that I have a lot more hope for because it's actually incredibly well insulated from the rest of Asia. Whether you're talking about the basically what is the extension of the Himalayas that go into the Chinese highlands in the southern part of China, Vietnam, Laos, border top of Burma there. All pretty highly insulated from any kind of occupying invasion force. You can get through it, but you need a massive logistics train to do that. And quite honestly, I think China's actually maybe learned their lesson. Literally back in the day when China was still trying to put itself together on the Communist Party, we had, 1973, they go into Vietnam and they get their asses completely handed to them. it wasn't pretty. And I think China's not interested in that. I think what they're far more interested in is dealing with maybe a little bit of like the Spratly Islands context, and maybe getting into Vietnam for control of naval zones. But actually, I think they have more reasons to fight with the Philippines, fighting with Taiwan, fighting with Japan. Go ahead.
Fundamentally just not an aggressive power. Again, like they learned it from watching us. The 20 years of U.S. dick waving taught that you've got to be aggressive and unpleasant and waste a lot of money on your military, and they're doing that. And it's just so sad. Like I had a lot more respect for China before Donald Trump. Donald Trump was China's best opportunity since Pearl Harbor, frankly. And they did absolutely nothing with it. And in fact, like lowered themselves to his level. Like they really thought, I mean, it's the Me Too aspect of China. Sorry, that has a different connotation now. But no, the sort of like, we're a great power too aspect of China. Like, it's so fucking sad. Like, they were like, okay, like sort of some, veneer of respectability, Rumsfeld style aggression is what we should be doing with doing that. And then we put this clown president in power, and they're like, "Oh, we'll do it too." It's laughable. I had a lot more respect for China. Well, I think the Chinese Communist. Actually, that's a prediction. I think the Chinese Communist Party's in its last 20 years. I think China will be fine.
I kind of concur with that. Like, China doesn't have to go to hell with the communists. Probably will. But
I don't really. Awful. Like it's awful. Like millions dead, et cetera, but I think China will endure.
Southeast Asia, actually, I've got a lot of just hope for. So to wrap that up, while I do have questions, particularly with what was it, Burma, aka Myanmar, had a coup last year. Is that largely if they muck it up, it'll be of their own doing throughout most of that region. And when you're looking at places like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia. Indonesia's the one that makes me throw up a lot of question marks because it's a tropical nation with 200 million people in it, and I'm like, this shouldn't work, but it does. How'd you do it? Yeah.
I think Noah Smith at Bloomberg just did a big long Indonesia. How did that happen? But yeah, no, it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. Like, can we jump to Africa? Because I don't want to leave Africa out, and I do.
Got about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Africa for me is very straightforward. If industrialization has turned the corner for people, and you've been hinting at this a lot, if they can access global supply chains or they can make their own in-house, what I call the Inner African Belt, which is largely the area kind of around the equator, or most of the people on that continent live, can actually do something to thrive, and they can turn the corner. Having guns really helps against crocodiles and hippos and rhinos and shit. Sorry about that. But the long and the short here is that they need to be able to have modern agriculture in a big way, and they're only really getting that down now, and that's been access to everything else that is, I would call it technological diffusion, is finally really gotten in there in a big way, and it's helped places like Nigeria and Kenya in a particularly great way, and they've been able to grow 10% almost every year, which everyone doesn't really talk about. If they can't maintain that because they're still reliant on the West to make those technologies work, they're hosed. They're so beyond hosed. And I don't even want to think about what Africa looks like in there, because you will probably see the 21st century be the bloodiest century, literally within the next decade, if they can't get that to work. But that does assume that the Americans don't make global capital financeable anymore, and global shipping lanes break down too. So there's a big caveat there, what if, but if the world is very much post-American here before too long, for one reason or another, I think Africa's boned. So, go for it.
Well, I think Africa has a lot of different aspects to it. It's a tremendously diverse place, tremendously diverse set of problems. One of the saddest things has got to be watching Ethiopia fall apart over the past couple of years, because it had a tremendously hopeful, amazing past 20 years, and they just couldn't. Sort of classic example of a ruling minority that refused to let go of power and is now in danger of being genocided, which is quite grim. And I'm bummed because I spent a lot of time on Ethiopia last year, but I haven't caught up with it. But I mean, it's a place with tremendous potential. I think that, honestly, I think that with what they've gotten from the Western world, you talk about technology diffusion, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's entirely possible that sort of a breakdown of U.S. hegemony could be the best possible. Because one of the nice things about Ethiopia, the thing that I enjoyed the most about covering the crisis in Ethiopia, is because it's like almost the only serious war this century that wasn't more or less directly the U.S.'s fault. There's really no. I mean, the Abiy Ahmed's partisans are convinced that it's a CIA plot, and we're all on the tank in the tank for the Tigrayans or this, that, and the other thing, and that's actually just not the case. As far as I've been able to discern, it's like it is their problem. And the U.S. is, of course, finding ways to be unhelpful, but as we do, but it's not our fault. What's so tragic is that there was this amazing period after the end of the Cold War when we stopped ripping the place to shreds in service to,
freedom and democracy and capitalism and all of it.
Largely non-existent after the 1950s competition with the Soviet Union. When that finally ended, there was the 90s, things were messed out, things were still a mess, but largely the U.S. was let better things happen, and horrible things happen in the Congo in the aftermath of Mobutu Sese Seko, and Rwanda, because the French built a genocidal regime in Rwanda, but anyway. These horrific things happened, but by the first decade of this century, finally the U.S. was out of the way. Finally, the West was largely out of the way. We had these Millennium Development Goals that were kind of helpful things, helping with HIV, helping with debt relief, and things were phenomenal. It was amazing. The Sahel, which was always, since independence, the Sahel had been oh God, they can't ever get anything right. Every country was growing by 5-10% a year. And then we murdered it. Then we blew up Libya. Then AFRICOM came in and stole a decade of economic development from the poorest people in the world. And in 2000, with the NATO invasion of Libya in 2011. So it's just I hear sure, there's definitely things that we provide. There's definitely things that Africa, aid and whatnot. But I often wonder if the U.S. disappearing, which I don't think is very likely, that might be
actually make things better.
Might make things significantly better.
So, here's my thoughts on this one, because I totally get where you're coming from. The two things that I keep seeing is that you're still seeing a large amount of food imports come to the area, which means they're not really self-sufficient yet. That's a massive concern for me. And the other part is capital influx. This tells me that these economies are not value-added enough to where they're making their own capital to finance their own growth. It's still largely coming from Western institutions, whether you just call it general banking or general investment firms. If they can change that, if they can escape from that to where they can do that on their own turf, wonderful win. There's a few countries that do look like they are going to do okay. Nigeria and Angola look like that they can export enough oil to the Europeans that they can kind of remain afloat, but there's a few other ones out there that I'm doing the hard math on, and I'm just not seeing things go their way.
Nigeria and Angola specifically are probably the largest petro producers in Africa. Is that right?
Yes.
Probably. Yeah. The problem is, I think that what's going to happen, I am as bearish as I am on Saudi Arabia, or post-Saudi Arabia is going to be pumping oil forever. Texas is going to be pumping oil forever. And I think there will come a point. I mean, Nigeria and Angola have resources that are useful enough and close enough to ports that they'll continue to pump. But the price that they'll be able to win for that is going to decline mightily. So I'm generally pretty bearish on petrostates. Not that they're going to, stop producing, though some of them will. Canada maybe. But I think the price that they're going to be able to win for that is going to go down, which is going to lead to quite a high level of chaos. Nigeria is a country I'm generally pretty pessimistic about.
I totally get that. I'm just looking at this from the lens of what I said about the Middle East. I really don't see I really don't see the Middle East going well next year, and particularly I see a clash between the Saudis and the Persians very, very likely. And if I'm correct in that one, huge yeah.
That's a quick clash.
You think so?
I mean, you look at the Abqaiq attack in 2019. It's like the Iranians have missiles that are far more competent than It's not they've got a Patriot system or they've got a Iron Dome derivative, whatever. Like the whole Saudi oil industry goes up, and that's like worldwide recession. That's like if the U.S. is truly stupid enough to let the JCPOA process disappear entirely and decides that on top of trying to crush Russia, we're going to big dog Iran for another 5-10 years. If we're really that fucking stupid, Iran has it entirely in its power to end Saudi Arabia. They just destroy that. I mean, what is Saudi Arabia like? What percentage of oil exports or of world production? Oh, I guess it's about what? It's about 10% of world production, probably 8% of exports or something along those lines.
Huge.
Iran has the missiles necessary. We have this fantasy about missile defense that we get from Gaza, where the Iron Dome manages to beat 5 or 6 missiles that were smuggled through tunnels at a time. And it's frankly nonsense. I mean, that technology is getting better, but the Iranians will end. If we're dumb enough to continue this Iranian vendetta, which is stupid because it makes us look bad. We are the good guys in Ukraine. I'm the super negative guy about U.S. foreign policy. Certainly we manipulated this result, but we're the good guys in Ukraine. We should focus on that. Instead, we're so focused because, of incentives and, missile companies to refuse to let go of any good enemy. We're so focused on frickin' Iran. And I don't see that as a war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I see that as Iran rather quickly ending Saudi Arabia. And we got a preview of that. And I can never pronounce it properly. ABQAIK attack in 2013. Anyway, it's 10:35. We should probably wrap up.
Yeah.
Can I spiel? Can I spiel? Or?
Yeah. Go ahead. But the last we had was South America, and this makes it basic. I see that going the same trend. It's literally the least warlike continent we've seen in human history. I don't see a lot of wars happening here. I don't see a lot of massive intervention and attention going to this continent. Just see kind of business as usual with South America. So.
It'd be phenomenal. Donald Trump saved Maduro. It's just the talk. If you're someone who hates socialism, was there a better thing than Venezuela? What happened to Venezuela? These clowns, shoot their mouths off for 15 years and then yield mass starvation. The international laughingstock that set back whatever cause of socialism. Decades and decades, and then Trump turned him into an anti-imperialist hero. It just absolute clown show, because they allowed. I don't know how they allow people like Elliot Abrams and Robert Kagan to still make.
I can tell you exactly why that happened. It's because Donald Trump didn't give a shit, and he wanted an excuse to get as many Venezuelan American voters to vote for him as possible.
Yeah, it's Florida politics.
Right, exactly. So he sacrificed U.S. interests in order to get even just the slightest advantage electorally. Just not even it's not even that many voters, right? But
I think one of the best things about Ukraine is similar to the George W. Bush years is that hopefully Washington D.C. will be distracted enough, making enough money that they don't have to go screw up Latin America any further.
They are definitely sending a lot of weapons. So
yeah. But that's grassroots. Anyway, my name is Rob Morris. I have a YouTube channel called the Mo Freedom Foundation. Confusingly, on TikTok, I'm at the More Freedom Foundation, and on YouTube, I'm at the Mo Freedom Foundation because I'm terrible at branding. I also have an Instagram now that I would love people to follow. It's got 200 people there. It's very small. But I've written a couple books. The sort of a quick one, if you want to just, my quick demolishing of everything that happened in the Middle East over the past 20 years. Sort of everything we know is terrorism is mostly just the U.S.-Saudi relationship. That's called Everybody's Lying About Islam, which is available on Amazon in paperback and Kindle form. And then there's my big doorstop, Avoiding the British Empire, which attempts to explain everything. I think nobody actually read it until people bought it, but nobody actually read it until they had nothing to do during COVID. So my next book's gonna be shorter. So there's that. I do something on YouTube every day. I mostly just 1-minute shorts. Every Tuesday I try to do something more. And yeah, I guess that's me.
Appreciate having you on here, Robert. I know we went over time, and I apologize for doing that, but we didn't know exactly where we were going, and somehow touring the world always takes way longer than it's supposed to when you have a bunch of nerds here. But I really appreciate you having me on. I don't know if you're going to use any of this content on your end, or if I need to send you off anything. I think
you're going to probably put this up on your own YouTube, and I'll put it on my community page, and yeah.
Sounds good. All right. So if anyone is just rolling in on the Twitch chat here, or is coming by and isn't familiar with us, Tyberius D studied economics, political science. I kind of am just a massive nerd when it comes to all those things. But if for some reason you don't want to see my geopol stuff, I'm also a massive nerd when it comes to Star Trek and Star Wars and 40K and all these things. So you can check out reviews that I've done, whether Commander or William T. Riker is actually a good character or not. I've also done a lot when it just comes to hosting panel shows. We have the Mascot podcast, which we're kind of famous for, which brings big names like Counterpoints and a few others to the scene, where we just get together and we have a chat about issues and what we see about them. And Robert, if you want to stop by at any point just to kind of talk about your own domestic politics and what your opinion is, you'd be very welcome. Without further ado, I've been Tyberius D. It's good to see you all, and we'll catch you next time.